1890 and died on March 15th, 1937. He was born into a pretty wealthy family and planned to attend Brown College. He did for a while, but he never was able to graduate. Some account this to his, I suppose, sickly childhood, you could say, and others speculate that he just really wasn't cut out for the college itself. His midlife pursuits were mainly consisted of launching a self-published magazine called The Conservative in 1915, and that didn't take off, so eventually it fell apart. And in 1921, the magazine Weird Tales bought some of his stories. Now, he never gained any kind of recognition for his literary pursuits until after death, and even fell into poverty during the later years of his life. Some of his most recognized works are The Rats in the Walls, At Mountain's Madness, The Call of Cthulhu, and The Shadow of Our Time. And another really, really important note to remember about him is that he had some very deep-seated racist and anti-Semitic beliefs, and even wrote a story called On the Creation of Insular Hard R, where he equated Black people to beasts and denies their humanity. And that is very evident in the piece that we've read. Does anyone have any questions so far? Alrighty, I'll keep on going. The themes that I recognized in this story were fear of the unknown, which plays a very big role in the horror aspect of it. Another theme that is really easy to spot for me anyways was racism and a skewed view of humanity. Now, for the fear of the unknown, I got that from the very first paragraph. It says, "We live in a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far." Did anyone else share this thought or want to share any opinions on it?
Ron, Lauren, what do you think about
Sorry,
this?
can you repeat that? My dog was barking right next to me. I didn't hear you.
Alrighty. The key passage that I really felt that introduced fear of the unknown as a central theme for this story was the very first paragraph, where it says, "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far." Do you guys have any thoughts on it, or did any other points stand out to you?
So to build on what Nicole said so far, this is definitely a key theme in Lovecraft's work, right? Fear of the unknown, definitely so in this story. So just to give you guys a little bit of context, about like what Lovecraft has done. You know, he kind of invented his own mythology of sorts. The Call of Cthulhu is one key piece of the mythology that he's made. You got guys probably about midway through the story when it's talking about Inspector Legrasse. You know, it talks about the great old ones, right? The great old ones. So his idea, his mythology is almost these. We do have, there are all these unknown like gods almost, right? And they're so terrible, they're so beyond the pale of human comprehension that we can't understand them, right? Just the very thought, you could probably put madness up here too, Nicole, right? Madness, right? Just the very thought of even trying to wrap your mind around like what do these gods look like, right? Is enough to drive you mad in Lovecraft's work. So it's this idea that the human brain can only take so much until it pretty much explodes, right? Because the secrets of the universe are that vast, right? It's a little bit of a hard view to take like especially if you're a religious person, right? You're like, there's no other gods and all this stuff, right? He insinuated, right? We don't know, and it's the fact that we don't know which makes it scary, right? And Cthulhu is the most famous of his gods. Um, let's see here. Well, I'll show you guys a picture in a minute, but you guys might have seen Cthulhu before. He's like the guy. He has like an octopus face, right? He kind of has wings that look like a dragon, right? You guys have probably seen the imagery before of Cthulhu. If I had to guess,
Yeah, it's very popular in today's pop culture
right?
and in horror fans in general.
Have you guys heard of this, Ryan and Lauren? Have you guys heard of Cthulhu and Lovecraft and all this stuff before?
Yes, I've heard of Cthulhu many, many times. I know he is, in some ages of history, even prehistoric ages, he was considered to be a god. And in some Viking ages, he was considered to be something like Poseidon. And he would sit out and sea and sink boats and take the crewmates and all the boats, and they are never seen again for the rest of time. He's seen as like an unforeseen evil or evil god that if just the mere looking at him will change you into madness. I've also seen him in video games. There is some major lag on my end.
Yeah, it's good that he is. Like Lovecraft video games are very popular. Like I know one. There's actually a Call of Cthulhu video game that just came out a year or two ago. Um, there's board games. Like there's lots of like Lovecraft inspired board games. I've never played any of them, but I want to. Um, music, music. He's also very like Cthulhu shows up a lot of music, especially metal music. Any of you got Metallica fans in here?
Yes.
Right. Right. So you probably know Cthulhu from a few Metallica songs. Right. Dream No More is a song about the Call of Cthulhu. Right. It's about Cthulhu waking up and just destroying all of humanity and all this stuff. Right. So maybe Cthulhu shows up in a certain part of culture, right? The metalheads and gamer, all of us nerds, right? Gaming nerds, right? We're probably pretty familiar with it, right?
One question I had to pose was, do you all think that the narrator of our story and all those others who were consumed with this terror were justified in doing so? What were your thoughts on that?
What do you mean, Nicole?
I'm like not the pop culture, just based on the story itself. Do you think we were given reason to fear Cthulhu aside from speculation? Do you all think there was any evidence that shows that it wasn't something to fear, or do you think that everyone was right to be afraid of him?
I don't remember seeing evidence in the story. I could be wrong, but in the story, there was no evidence to be fearful other than just its appearance. That would be like the only reason you should be afraid of it, because it's described as having like tentacle fingers, claws, hands, being super, super tall, have gigantic wings. Any average human would be afraid of that because it's the height of a skyscraper.
Right.
What about you, Lauren? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't really think there is anything that they said to be afraid of that sides of their tales that they've said. It was just like they've been passed around by everybody to be afraid of it instead of actually being seen by it.
On to the next point that really stood out to me was racism. And the quote that I chose to really represent this goes along the lines of, they had stumbled on a dark cult totally unknown to them and infinitely more diabolic than even the blackest of the African voodoo circles. And what's interesting with this is it even plays into their fear of the unknown, but also it casts a very dark notation on African Americans and Black people in general. Can you all think of any other parts of the story that displayed this?
Yeah, it's all over the place and in the story. Like, I'm using the same PDF you guys are looking on. Like, if you take a look at page 12 of the PDF, if you have it pulled up, page 12. So part two of the story is about Inspector Legrasse, right, stumbling upon this cult of people who worship Cthulhu. Right. At the very top of the page, it says, examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to be men of a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally abhorrent type. Most were seamen, and a sprinkling of Negroes and mulattoes, largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands, gave a coloring of voodooism to the heterogeneous cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than Negro fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. And then right below it, he talks about the great old ones and sets up his mythology, right, about all the old gods, Cthulhu being one of them. So yeah, it's pretty. So the question here then is, right, how much? So it's pretty clear that Lovecraft, was a pretty racist guy, right? It's pretty clear. Back in the 20s when he was writing, right, the 20s was a time of xenophobia, right? Lovecraft lived up in the New England states. So he saw a lot of like mass immigration coming over, right? He did not trust immigrants. He came from this sort of old family, like Nicole said, right? He was born into money, but he was born into this old wealth type of situation. He just did not really trust. He just did not really trust other types of people, right? Yeah. So the question's raised then, how does this affect his horror, right? Is the scariest thing in the story the voodoo cult who have orgies and worship Cthulhu, right? What do you guys think of that? For the audience, at least, well, because we're talking about Lovecraft, right? He's, so imagine what his audience would have thought, right? So for his audience at the time, would that have been the scariest thing in the story, do you think?
I'm going to assume that this book is pretty old, like 1900s, and at the time, this is the most kind of like, what do you call it? Media kind of thing that they have, kind of like the news and all that.
It was written in the 20s, right?
Yeah, even more so back then, it would be kind of. I'd say this is probably one of the most fearful horror stories you could think of, because it's talking of something like an old god that could reign over men and kill and then wipe out all of humanity or existence. I'd say that make this the audience more fearful than it would more then than it would now.
Right. this story probably wouldn't get published nowadays, right? With all the racism stuff in here.
Very, very doubtful.
Yeah. Lauren, looked like you had something to say there.
I was just agreeing that I honestly don't think that if this was written today that it would be published with how racist it is. And I honestly think that this would honestly scare the audience more with the voodoo people than it would with the Cthulhu. It'd try to keep people out of swamps and everything.
Right, Nicole, what do you think?
Did you all? I think that if this was written today, it would take a maybe insane publisher to put this out into the world. And if it by chance did, that would have gotten a lot of backlash, rightfully so. What did you all think about the encounters that our narrator's uncle and Johansson had with Black people right before they died?
Right, it's speculated on that the uncle was murdered by the Black voodoo cult. Right, so that's how it's speculated on. At the end of part 2, he speculates that's the case. It is curious that because the story takes place down in Louisiana, right? That's where part 2 takes place with the LaGrasse part of the story. It's curious that there's no it is curious that there's no like backwoods white people right now, worshiping this thing, right? I mean, if anything, with all the cults today in our world, like QAnon, right? You would think that it would be some dumb white people doing this type of stuff, right? Right. So, what the hell? I'm feeling feisty today, right? So, speaking of which, I was listening to some conspiracy theories that they have earlier. They think that there has not been a legitimate U.S. president since U.S. Grant in the 1870s, because the United States went off the gold standard then. So they think that on March the 4th, Donald Trump will become president again, right? And become the first legitimate president we've had since 1870 something. So
was he not legit during his first term?
I guess not. I guess not.
I might agree with him on that.
Right, but we're talking about cults, right? Today, it doesn't really seem. you guys get where I'm going. I'm just having fun with it, right?
But getting back to the story a little bit, did it strike anyone as interesting at the certain demographic of people who were affected by these dreams and sort of communications that Lovecraft alluded to with Cthulhu? It was a very certain group of people. It wasn't just anybody.
Right. So it was the people affected by the dreams were more creative types, right? It talks about how they're like architects, artists,
Scientists,
like
researchers.
Right. You don't really see the common Joe being affected by the dreams. It's an interesting concept. So the whole setup of the story is there's this ancient city that's been sunk into the sea, right? The city of I don't even want to try to pronounce it. R'lyeh something. I think that's how you pronounce it.
R'lyeh,
right? But it's the city where all the old gods are asleep, right? They're asleep. They're dormant. They're put under so they're awake in one sense, in the fact that they're sort of, their minds go beyond, and type of communication go beyond what humans are used to, right? So they can communicate by telepathy and all this stuff. And they want to be released again, right? To unleash unspeakable horrors on the world, right? So that's why all these different people were getting these dreams, right? Because of the telepathy that they're putting out to try to be free again. It's been speculated on that that city has been under the sea for millions of years. And suddenly, this random boat captain at the end stumbles upon it and reawakens Cthulhu, right, for a short period of time. It's interesting. It's interesting that Cthulhu kind of went back to sleep again, right? It's kind of a funny. It's kind of funny at the end, right? Cthulhu's awake. He's ready to destroy the world. This boat captain just rams the boat into Cthulhu, right? Cthulhu's like, "Screw this! I'm going back to sleep." Right? It's kind of what happens. It's kind of what happens at the end.
And I know it was commented on a lot throughout the story as far as the city that Cthulhu inhabits, is that the geometry of it was incorrect as far as law of physics go, and that it couldn't have been built the way that it was. What did you all think of that?
Are you done with the handout, Nicole? Is there more?
No, I have one more point. Sorry. My last point is the skewed view of humanity, and the passage that I got that from was mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. And the greatest question that I wanted to pose to you all was, do you think that this reflected all of humanity at that point, or do you think it reflected Lovecraft's view of humanity?
So it is a very pessimistic view of humanity, right? This, to say the least, right? That without laws, right, we are wild, right? We are primal animals, in a sense. Right?
I'd say it's likely true, simply because of what Mr. Yeager said. Because without laws or rules, we'll revert just back to our primal instincts, and the languages we speak won't even be the same. We likely will not be speaking like this at all. Most of our knowledge would revert back to like primitive caveman knowledge. I'd say that this is pretty much a accurate view of what humanity could be like if we had no laws or morals.
How about you, Lauren? Do you share that view?
I do share that view with Ryan and Dr. Yeager. We thought of it as if it could be Lovecraft's thought of humanity or not, because I do believe that this could just be, if we lost our humanity, that we'd just go back to like caveman times or something.
Have any of you guys ever seen those silly movies, the Purge movies? Have any of you guys ever seen those? They're pretty recent, so I'm not talking about old movies here. Yeah, but those movies are about one day of the year the government gives you the license to commit any crime you want, right? So it's really silly setup, but it's interesting because it's about like, what would people do? Would you murder somebody that you hate at work, right? Would you plunder and loot and salvage, right? People spend like the whole year like getting security systems so that nobody can break into their house, right? It kind of, I bring it up just because those movies have a very similar view of humanity that Nicole is alluding to here with Lovecraft, right? Without laws, we do become brutes. What do you think, Nicole? Do you think this is a cynical view of humanity, or you think people were better than this?
I think that people are a bit better than that. I think that, if you look back on kind of, I'm trying to think how to say it, just older civilizations, you still see that bit of humanity, even though laws weren't as strict, and even though we didn't have the same ways of enforcing them. You'll always have bad people, but I think that human nature is inherently to not harm unless you have to.
Right. Yeah, there'll always be bad people, right? But for the most part, they're the outliers, I think, compared to. I think that's a good way to look at it for sure. Lovecraft would definitely not agree with us here.
Another fact that I found that I didn't think really had a place in my bit about him is that he actually married a Jewish woman. And one of the supposed quotes that I found on him was that he said she was surprisingly well assimilated.
Right. From what I've understand, it wasn't a very passionate marriage between the two. Like it was a very sexless marriage. I've read before about them. So maybe he felt some bitterness in that regard, that it didn't quite work out the way that it should have. I don't know if he was as anti-Semitic as he was, racist against black people and stuff. I don't know that. Probably a little bit, right? Because anti-Semitism was very rampant in the 20s, right? It wasn't just in Germany, right? It was in the United States too. You guys know that there was lots of Jewish immigrants that tried to come to America to escape Hitler. And the United States turned them away. They wouldn't let them in here. Right? Thousands and thousands of Jewish immigrants they wouldn't allow in here. Right? So think about, that's one of the stains on our history, right? The fact that we wouldn't let them in here during that time because of our own prejudices that we had. So here, let's talk a little bit about, first, Nicole, you asked that point about the city and its geometry just now. I actually planned a little bit for this. Lovecraft has inspired a lot of interesting art, right? Of all the writers we're reading in this class, Lovecraft is probably the most important for horror today, right? He's inspired so much horror movies and all this type of stuff. So this is a picture. Let me see if I can pull it up good. This is a artist painting of the city of R'lyeh, right? It's described as being so horrifying because its geometry goes beyond the limits of like what our geometry does. There's so many angles that seem unnatural, right? And all this type of stuff. So you can kind of get a glimpse in this image as far as like how that would, imagine like being in the middle of the ocean and then just discovering this, right? It would, that alone would probably blow your mind. Here's show you guys a picture of Cthulhu. Yeah, this is the famous image of Cthulhu that's been drawn. Maybe it'll pull it up. Yeah, here we are. Yeah, so he's got like the dragon wings, right? He's got the tentacles, the demonic looking eyes. His face is sort of human-like until you get to the octopus part, right? So here's a question for you guys. Why paint Cthulhu like an octopus, like mixed with a dragon, right? Have any of you guys ever found octopuses to be kind of freaky as far as creatures within the deep ocean, right? We don't really know a lot about them, right? Have any of you guys ever thought they're kind of octopuses are kind of creepy?
I think it's startling how intelligent they are because they really are very smart animals.
Yeah, very very intelligent animals, right? Some people like conspiracy type people even think octopuses are really aliens, right? Aliens that are dwelling within our ocean, right? Just because they are that intelligent. I don't know if they're quite on par with humans, but they are nonetheless very very intelligent, conniving creatures, right? Lauren, what do you think? Are octopuses creepy?
Well, the first time I ever saw one was whenever that Pirates of the Caribbean movie came out. Davy Jones was the main character. So I always thought they kind of looked weird.
Davy Jones kind of looks like Cthulhu a little bit with the face, right? You could probably tell that that was probably inspired by this to some degree. Um, yeah, that whenever we think about the limits of our knowledge as far as humanity goes, right, we're always discovering new things about the universe, right? Since Lovecraft was writing about 100 years ago, right, but ever since then, think about all we've discovered as far as about space, right? They didn't have any conception of like what black holes were, right, in the 1920s, right? Whenever we think about our own world, the bottom, he was right on the fact that the bottom of the ocean is the scariest part, right? That goes beyond our knowledge. There might be stuff down there that's kind of freaky that we don't know about, right? So hence the fact this city is buried so far deep within the ocean. Think about like lots of times interesting Lovecraft type tales are told in Antarctica as well. Like Nicole mentioned, at the Mountains of Madness. That's a story about scientists going to Antarctica and finding a lost city of the great old ones too. Right. So lots of lots of stuff in our world that science hasn't quite plumbed the depths of yet, right? To say the least, right? Even when we think about animals, right? Just last year, they discovered that a certain type of shark. I don't know if you guys saw this story. Just last year, they discovered that a certain type of shark. This shark had been alive since the 1600s. Right?
It's the Greenland shark, I believe.
Right. Yeah, yeah. This type of shark had been alive since the 1600s. So like that shark was floating around in the ocean when like Shakespeare was living, right? So that's kind of freaky to think about, right? Any living creature that can live that long, right? That kind of blows our minds a little bit, right? So much about the universe, even our own world, much less the larger cosmos, we don't know about. So what do you guys think? Is this freaky? Right? Is this freakier than anything we've encountered so far in this class? We've encountered insane narrators, right? We've encountered like doctors who are thirsty for knowledge at the expense of their patience. Right? We've encountered spooky woods with Sleepy Hollow. Right? I don't know. You guys find this stuff kind of scary whenever you really. This is intellectual horror, right? This is horror that's not jumping out at you and going boo. This is horror that is disturbing when you start thinking about it, right? So I don't know. What do you guys think of this notion of cosmic horror then with what I've just been talking about?
I feel that it is definitely very creepy in a way once you start thinking on it. And I think that the most frightening part for me and for the Call of Cthulhu specifically is just that we never get to know what Cthulhu's actual intent is and what their role was, eons and eons ago.
Right. Maybe he's not he is whatever pronoun you want to attribute to Cthulhu, right? Maybe it's not completely hostile to humanity, right? Humanity is almost like an ant to this thing, right? As far as its significance goes. Yeah. Not knowing is scarier, right? Other thoughts on the notion of cosmic horror?
Cosmic horror on this scale of like old or evil gods is seen in many, many video games.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very adept in video games. I play them all the time. He is even like bosses in some of them, especially Cthulhu. Cthulhu is possibly the most widely known cosmic being that is just all around evil by almost every standard. I find it very, very interesting that this was kind of just made up. I don't know of any substantial evidence that he is actually real.
Now, Cthulhu is a fictional creation of Lovecraft. I don't think there's like any mythological basis for it or anything other than what Lovecraft came up with.
I found it really interesting the way that Lovecraft chose to describe Cthulhu and really the creature that he invented. Because, humans, when it comes to conceptualizing things, we use what we already know as building blocks. And so we really can't even think about something that we have no idea about. Like, we can't conceptualize some aliens because components of their design and of their physical features wouldn't be like anything we've ever seen. So he chose things that to him were that terrifying, which obviously, dragon wings, a octopus face, and a human body.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Like, even if you think about like monsters in movies and stuff, right? Most of them still do have human-like qualities. I mean, it's hard to think of any that don't, as far as that goes, right? They have a human-looking face or a human-looking body.
The only animal I can think of that is so far and so different from humans are eels. Eels are a big mystery to me and to scientists because we don't know how they reproduce. We have no idea. Absolutely none.
I've never thought of that before, but that is kind of creepy when you think about them, right? Eels. Yeah, I'll walk you guys through a few of the other of these other ones. He has this whole like pantheon of gods in his work. me show you guys this one. This one goes along with their racism theme. And this is another one of his creations. This one's supposed to be like bigger than Cthulhu within the importance angle. But this one's like the great big spaghetti. This one looks like the spaghetti monster, right? It's
Is
named.
this where the spaghetti church came from?
I think so. I think so. Right. This one's name. We're talking about Lovecraft, so we're not throwing words around lightly, right? But this one's name is Shub Niggurath, right? So you can kind of see like he even like used those like racist slurs even in like defining his gods and stuff. This is one of the most destructive ones within his pantheon. Like Cthulhu is actually like a low tier god in his rankings, I think.
Something I found really interesting is how Lovecraft equated the people who had the dreams about Cthulhu and had that, I guess, kind of communication with him as being kind of educated intellectuals and creatives, but the people that actually worshipped him and in the cults were people of minority and people who most likely weren't educated and didn't have access to things like that.
Right. And here's the painting of that god that I know about. That's why I say it's the spaghetti monster. Whoops. I don't know what I just did. Yeah, that's why I say it looks like the great spaghetti monster. Yeah, Nicole, you bring up an interesting point, right? The fact that education, even today when we think about cults, right? Education oftentimes doesn't have to do with just a race, right? Even education is the lack of helps create these types of cults, right? So it's pretty easy to see, like even with just like the QAnon crap, right? It's even kind of easy to see that lack of education correlates with cult creation, right? That's how you drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak. You believe something and that has no factual basis.
People who are uneducated or willfully ignorant will listen to anyone that has any type of air of confidence to themselves and that acts like they know what they're talking about.
Right. We live in we're all from the county, right? I mean, it's pretty easy to tell like different types of people in the county would probably would join a cult, right? I mean, it's sometimes easy to tell that with some of the crazy stuff they believe. There's actually a woman in I probably shouldn't be mentioning names, but screw it. Like there's actually a woman in Oceana who runs she runs some type of store over there who's part of this QAnon crap. Like she's talking about like how like throwing out like we should kill the Joe Biden and all this stuff on Facebook. And I think mom actually reported her to the FBI, so that should be fun, right?
Good on her.
Yeah. Yeah, so I forget what store it is. Somebody over there runs one's posting all kinds of crap. So yeah. So here's an interesting question for you guys. Lovecraft is a very controversial writer to teach in an English class. I didn't put him on the syllabus without some thought. because he is so racist and stuff, right? But at the same time, he's so imaginative, right? Like how many writers have influenced like so many other writers more than him almost, right? So what do you guys think about this, right? Even the question of a literary canon almost, right? Whenever we think about like horror writers, we're reading the standard stuff for the most part, right? Dracula, Frankenstein, Poe, Hawthorne, The Haunting of the Hill House, right? We're reading a lot of the classics. But this is a question I'm particularly interested for you to answer, Nicole, since you're going to be a future English major. What do you think about this? Do you think Lovecraft should be taught with an asterisk, perhaps, or do you think that he's better left off and forgotten and not taught to future generations because his views are so regressive? What do you guys think?
I think that as far as education goes, and as far as the people who have came before and have really laid out the tracks for us to be where we are, we should acknowledge their success and acknowledge the things they're good at, but condemn the things that we know to be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it would be okay to teach Lovecraft with that asterisk and with educating people on the skewed views that he had and on the misconceptions that he had.
Right. So what type of classroom does Lovecraft belong in? Would you even like we're in a college classroom, which is its own thing? Would you teach Lovecraft in a high school classroom, perhaps? What do you think about that?
I feel like if it was an AP class and if I had the right group of students, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And also depending what state I was on. But if I was here in West Virginia and I had students that were similar to the ones that I went to high school with, no, I would not.
Like, you can kind of imagine the giggles you would get, right? Whenever like these words are said and whatnot, right?
And them getting repeated down the hallways and the very few minority students having to put up with that.
Now that's the problem, right? It's easy for us to talk. Everybody in here's white, right? It's easy for us to talk about it. But even like imagine if we only had like one black student in the class or something, right? That student might feel feel uncomfortable, to say the least, right?
I think we should even feel uncomfortable in a way talking about not just talking about this, but that aspect of Lovecraft, because that was a view that was held very widely by a lot of white people, and that still affects Black people today.
Right, the prejudices about like especially rural areas, right, that we get here with Black people. Like the professor pretty much gets shanked at the end of part 2, right? So yeah, very, very much troubling stuff. What do the other two of you guys think? You think Lovecraft has a place, or do you think that he's better left forgotten?
With how known his stories are, especially Cthulhu being popular even now, like Cthulhu is still seen in, well, I'm going to say video games because that's what I do, that's what I know. They're seen everywhere in video games. I'd say he'd be a very good person to use for a literature class simply because he came up with the idea himself in a story that he wrote.
Right.
I find it very interesting to like read about him and learn how the character that is used in what we see today was created.
Yeah, what games can you think of off the top of your head that has Cthulhu? in it?
Secret World Legends. He is a boss in a dungeon that you can do. He is the final boss. He is way bigger than any other character you can make in the game, and you can kill him. That would be the first game that comes to my mind because that's the game I played for like 400 hours.
Terraria, I know he's in that game.
Yeah.
Yeah. But think about like all the shows and stuff even that we watch that has this type of creature, right? Stranger Things is very Lovecraftian, right? It's about these, that's pretty much what it is, about this entity that's beyond their understanding, right? That's the little kid in season 2, like crosses the threshold and sees it, right? So it's very much Lovecraft oriented.
You have The Thing.
Right, definitely another creature that goes beyond our understanding. It's playing in the movie theater in Beckley right now, by the way.
Really?
Yeah, if you're brave enough to go to the movie theater right now during COVID, it's playing out here. So we're going to be watching it in our film class later this semester. Lauren, have you ever seen this kind of stuff before? I know Ryan said he has because of his gamer interests. Have you ever heard of this stuff before?
I've seen Stranger Things and all of that, but I've never seen any of this other stuff you've been talking about. I've never even heard of Lovecraft before you assigned us this week.
Right. So there's lots of even like words that come from Lovecraft. Like whenever we have the word Gotham, right, we oftentimes think about Batman, right? Gotham City. But Gotham is the name of a town in Lovecraft's mythos, right? So even that's where that word comes from. Is from Lovecraft. So another fun fact for you all. This we don't really see a lot of it in this story, but his stories are often really heavily invested in setting too. Like he likes to play on like the backwoods of New England. Right, New England was where he was from. Right? So he often plays on the backwoods type places up through there. Whenever we think of New England today, we think of it as mostly the more cultured part of the United States, right? But he plays on it as being very backwoods and stuff, kind of like Sleepy Hollow was. Right?
When I think of New England, I always think about hauntings and Stephen King and horror and Salem and everything like that.
Think about how much even Stephen King has been inspired by Lovecraft. He even says as much, right? That like no one can escape Lovecraft's influence, right? If you're a horror writer, almost. He's so interesting too because the guy did, like you said, Nicole, the guy really didn't sell any books during his life, right? It was only after his life that this stuff became widely read and famous and all this good stuff.
One really interesting fact that I read about him is that he wrote almost or over 100,000 letters in his life. I don't know if that's accurate, but I thought that is a lot of letters.
It is accurate, right? It's very true. What did you guys make of Lovecraft? So we're talking about his influence and all that. What did you guys make of Lovecraft's style? I told you guys the other day he's a bit of a harder read than what we've encountered to this point, right? So Lauren, Ryan, I'll be especially interested to hear what you all have to say about this. How was Lovecraft as a read? Did you struggle through it? Did you get through it?
I'm not gonna lie. Some of the words that were in the story, I had no idea what they meant. I had to stop every so often just to look at what the word means, because it doesn't feel like it's written in old English. Like, you know what I'm talking about, like the old writing style, like thou, thus,
Right.
It seems more like a newer style of writing, but it's different in a way that I can't really describe, and it makes it kind of harder for me to read because it uses words and phrases that I just don't recognize.
Do you have any examples of words that you had to look up?
I'd have to find one. I don't particularly remember them. Let me look through real quick. I'll come back to that.
All right. Lauren, how was he as a read for you?
It took me a little while for me to actually be able to read it. I had to stop reading it for a little while and then come back to it and start again. It took me about 3 times to finally finish it.
Right. And what both of you have said doesn't surprise me at all, right?
I found one word that means something completely different nowadays, but is used differently in this story. And I'm not sure. It's kind of offensive to people who are like men who like other men or women who like other women. Like, he uses the word queer a lot, but he doesn't use it meaning that at all. He means strange or what was the other meaning of the word? I don't have to look it up again.
Yeah, that is the original meaning of the word. So he didn't mean it in that, like homophobic way. It was, that word was later. It's kind of interesting how words grow and evolve with time, right? A word might mean something completely different in 1920 compared to 2020, right? But yeah, that word was meant to be, its original meaning was weird, and that was used as a pejorative term later, right? So it has that added association with it. So yeah, words and their meanings change, right? I'm glad you pointed that word out particularly. I told you guys at the beginning of class, queer theory. Like whenever we talk about sexuality in literature, anytime we're talking about sexuality that's not heterosexuality, right? They adopted that word queer theory because it has been a pejorative term, and they're kind of embracing it, right, as a nasty word that they're using as a liberating word, right? Yeah, Lovecraft is always a challenging writer to teach. Um, just because students do tend to struggle with him a bit more. It's that way by his design. He wrote in a very archaic style, even for the 1920s. You guys could probably Poe and even Hawthorne were easier to read than him, right? Because their styles are less convoluted. Lovecraft looked back to the 1700s as the ultimate period of culture, right? He looked back and read through a lot of these old British novels, um, like stuff like Paradise Lost and stuff like that, even, right? He looked back at that time as the zenith of culture, right? And he looked down on anything that came after. So that's why he writes in this really archaic style with this really archaic vocabulary and all this good stuff. So even that is by design with him. That's why he's harder to read than other writers we're going to encounter.
I feel like for me personally, the stories that we've been reading in the literature class have helped me prepare for this read, and I had to take some breaks in between, but overall, it wasn't too bad.
Right? It's not like reading the Canterbury Tales in Middle English, right? It's nothing quite like that.
I will say I had a lot of fun reading those out loud and just guessing the pronunciation.
Right. Once you get those vowels down, it's fairly easy. Right, so very good, very good. Now, we've had a better we've probably had the three of us when you and me, we probably had a better conversation about Lovecraft than any other time I've ever tried to teach him before. Like, students usually kind of give up on it about midway through and don't finish it. So you guys are ahead of the game compared to even some other classes where I've taught him before. So,
Has anyone else presented on Lovecraft in any of
No,
your classes?
you're the first person to ever present on him. So, yeah. Yeah, this is a relatively new assignment I'm doing, was the presentation. Like, I tried it and I thought it worked, so I'm doing it more and more. But it's been a couple of years since I've taught him last. He doesn't come up too often in my classes, but in a horror class, you can't get away with not talking about him for a day. If you guys are interested in Lovecraft, maybe you want to read more. He has a lot of really other good stories. At the Mountains of Madness is one. The Rats in the Walls, which Nicole pointed out, that's a story that's not about the old gods or anything like that. That's just literally about this guy going crazy and hearing rats in the walls. Right? So that's a really fun one.
I have a question that's a little bit off topic. Do you know of a novella or short story that was about a ship that gets taken over by rats and the rats kill and eat everybody? I don't remember the name of it, but I've read that in like middle school and that terrified me.
I remember reading one in middle school called Three Skeleton Key, and it was about the same thing that you just said, but it was in a lighthouse instead, and they were trying to find these 3 keys, and the rats ate everybody.
I think that's the one.
The same way.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that. That's interesting. I know when we read Dracula in a few weeks, there's a ship in Dracula that gets infested with rats just because Dracula's on board. So we'll see that here in a couple of weeks. That's probably not what you were thinking of. That's a story completely about rats in your case. Another Lovecraft story I would mention is The Shadow over Innsmouth. That's another really good one. And that's a story about this port town, right? And this port town that becomes swayed by the old gods, and these people start turning into like fish-like creatures. So I would recommend that one too. Shadow over Innsmouth. So the Dunwich Horror is another interesting one I would recommend. So yeah, if you're interested in them, read more. Maybe if any of you guys ever want to do your paper on Lovecraft at the end of the term, reading a couple more of his stories besides Call of Cthulhu might be useful. So next week we are reading on Tuesday. We are reading 2 stories. We're reading William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. We're reading Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man Is Hard to Find. So those are our 2 stories for next week. These 2 stories are part of a genre called Southern Gothic. Right, they take place in the U.S. South. Right, so we'll talk more about what all that entails next week. But as you guys see, setting plays a big part in those stories. Those stories don't really have much supernatural going on. Right, these are stories about how awful people are at their core. Right, so it'll be something different compared to what we've been talking about. So 2 great stories. Especially A Good Man's Hard to Find. That's one of my favorites. I think you guys will enjoy both of those. Next week's our last week on short stories. After that, we'll be talking about these books. So next week too, I will be giving you guys your first short paper. So you can expect me to talk about that at some point next week. Okay. So any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, guys, we'll see you next week.
I'll see you in like 20 minutes.
See you in 20 minutes.